Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Gyarados EX and how to counter it, right? What are the best ways to beat Gyarados EX? The reason I wanted to make this video is because over the last few weeks of tournaments, Gyarados EX has been absolutely dominating. A lot of people are running into it on the ladder, and it is a very oppressive deck, an extremely powerful deck, and I just wanted to go over some of the different decks and different ways that we can counter Gyarados and defeat it a little bit more consistently. That's sort of the whole purpose of this video. So the first thing I'm going to do here is pull up on play.limitless.com. We're going to take a look at some statistics that give us a little bit more insight on, the things that Gyarados struggles against and the decks that do well against Gyarados. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just take a look at the meta share of that last Ursa Days Pocket Weekly tournament with over 1,500 players. I made a video about this total tournament in general and the metagame from this tournament yesterday, so if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. But in specifically, I just want to take a look at Gyarados. So just as, to strictly, point out my case here that Gyarados is dominating, I just wanted to showcase, these are all of the top play decks from this 1,500 player tournament, the largest tournament so far of Mythical Island, and yeah, this is kind of the largest sample size that we have to work with. But as we can see, these are the most played decks. We have Gardevoir and Mewtwo, not a great win rate. Celebi, not a great win rate. Scolipede, not a great win rate. And then we jump right up to Gyarados with a 57% win rate. So yes, Gyarados is being heavily dominated right now in the meta, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a way to consistently beat Gyarados. It's just that, at least in this case of the tournament, there wasn't necessarily the metagame in terms of the decks that people were playing didn't really reflect the counter for Gyarados. In fact, we actually saw more of a counterplay to Mewtwo, which was the most played deck, but it wasn't the most successful deck. Scolipede, very good matchup against Mewtwo, but Gyarados, what cards are good against Gyarados, right? That's what we're going to talk about a little today, but let's go into the specific matchup spreads that Gyarados in this tournament played against. So as we can see here, out of over 800 total games that this Gyarados and Greninja deck played, and that's the deck we're going to take a look at. It's the most common version of Gyarados, which I also did make a video on, so if you wanted to, check out how to play this deck or learn about this deck and specifically, go check out that video as well. But this is going to be the Gyarados with Druddigon and Greninja deck. Played a ton of matches here, 500 wins, 359 losses, and 12 ties. So a large sample size of games here to take a look at. But as we can see, 70.5% win rate against Mewtwo. So Mewtwo very much struggles against Gyarados. I think that's one of the big upsides with Gyarados and why it's been so dominant is because people are choosing to play Mewtwo and Gardevoir with Mew and the new Mythical Slab. I mean, that deck is extremely good. In fact, it does really well across the entire format other than Gyarados. So, it's a kind of a reason not to play it. I know it was the most played deck in this tournament, but moving forward, I do suspect that that will change and the metagame will kind of even out a little bit more so. But yeah, so Gyarados, very good win rate against Mewtwo. This right here, we see a 46.3% win rate. That's just because it tied against itself 10 times, but it's always going to be a 50-50, right? It's not going to win it and lose to itself more than not. That's just how the math works. Very good win rate against Celebi and a very good win rate against Scolipede and Weezing, right? So these are all the most played decks in this tournament, at least in the last couple days. Mewtwo, Celebi, Scolipede, and Gyarados is absolutely dominating all of them. So clear to us that we need a more even distribution of decks that people are playing. Gyarados is kind of defeating what we consider to be the best decks right now, the most consistent, most overall powerful decks. Gyarados is just on top of that. So an anti-meta, a counter-meta needs to sort of form, and that is what I believe will happen, and this video is kind of meant to help aid that particular progression, right? So as we scroll down a little bit, you might have noticed, look at these decks here. So against Pikachu and Raichu, not great win rates, right? 9 and 39 versus Pikachu and Substrika, and only a 36 or 37% win rate rather against Pikachu and Raichu. So it's clear to us that Pikachu is certainly a good counter to Gyarados. However, there are other options that necessarily aren't Pikachu that can do well against Gyarados and have particular aspects of that of their decks that can help them in that matchup. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna see and showcase all of the decks that really do have a good chance against Gyarados, and we're gonna talk about them, right? That's what we're gonna do right now. So first things first, let's talk about Pikachu. This one that we're going to see first here is Pikachu and Raichu. So why is Pikachu good against Gyarados? Well, Pikachu is the top aggro/tempo deck in the game. Pikachu is one of the most consistent attackers. It is electric type, so it hits weakness on Gyarados. This is pretty important. However, one thing that is a little bit concerning when going up against Gyarados is that we're not one-hit KOing Druddigon, right? Oftentimes Druddigon, when we're going against Gyarados, it's kind of sitting in the active spot. It's pretty imposing with 100 HP. Pikachu, if you have 3 electric-type Pokemon on your bench, only has 90 damage maximum of its output, right? Which you're not hitting for super effective against Druddigon, so unfortunately, we're not one-hit KOing Druddigon. But a big aspect of this deck, something that's extremely important in this matchup, is for us to one-hit KO Druddigons. So This deck list here that I'm showing is only running one Giovanni, it's running one blue. So what I would recommend is if you're going to be playing Pikachu and Raichu, which in my opinion is overall the strongest Pikachu deck, I would personally be running 2 Giovanni. So in this, I actually like this list completely. I think this list is almost perfect, except I would maybe cut out the blue and add a second Giovanni just so that we can pop that Giovanni, one-hit KO with Druddigon on the active spot, and then hopefully by turn 2 or turn 3, right after we do that, our opponent's Gyarados isn't set up, and then we can start kind of chipping away, right? And KOing either the Magikarp that they bring up, things like that. So 2 Sabrina, also important. We definitely want 2 Sabrina and 2 Giovanni. And here we see 2 Pokeball, 2 Research. I think that's got to stay. We actually see 2 copies of the new Electabuzz card. And this is sort of interesting, right? We can kind of mold this list a little bit, but overall, I think that Pikachu with Raichu is still a strong contender against Gyarados, but if you're going to be running Pikachu with Raichu, this specific version of Pikachu, I would run 2 Giovannis just so we can get that 100 damage output on Pikachu, one-hit KO the Druddigon, and keep the pace up a little bit and put a little bit more pressure on our opponent's Magikarp / Gyarados that might be kind of sitting on their bench. And that's my opinion. Now, the Raichu deck is good because we do also have Electabuzz, which is a bench sniping card. It does 40 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, so you can hit a benched Magikarp and one-hit KO it. However, that's for 2 energies, and what we'll see a little bit is that the Zebstrika deck has maybe a little bit of an easier way to do that. So the upside, however, with running Electabuzz is that it does work with Lieutenant Surge, right? So even though we're investing energies in Pokemon maybe early game like Pikachu or Zapdos, if we do find our Electabuzz, we can bring it up into the active spot and then just play our Lieutenant Surge, and then we have an option to bench snipe a Magikarp. So Electabuzz is going to be really good in that Gyarados matchup, but it's just a good card in general because it works with Lieutenant Surge. I would highly recommend it. If you're playing Raichu with Pikachu, I would also definitely play the Electabuzz. So this deck focuses a little bit more on one-hit KO potential with that, Raichu doing 140 damage, but Electabuzz does have the option to do that. So that is one option. The other one that I want to take a look at is this new Golem deck. This Golem deck actually won this last tournament, but there are a few key aspects of this deck that make it pretty decent against Gyarados. Of course, the first being that Golem has 160 HP, which means that you're safe from getting one-hit KO'd by Gyarados, which is really important. Now, we do 120 damage. That's in its own right isn't enough to KO a Gyarados. However, after we use the guard press attack, we take 30 less damage from attack. So we effectively have 190 HP. So we're safe from getting KO'd. So this deck doesn't have we're not hitting for weakness on Gyarados. We're not doing, any one-hit KO potential, which is important to note. However, we do run Hitmonlee in this list. Now, this deck that won the tournament was actually only running 1 copy of Hitmonlee, but however, if we want to really counter Gyarados, what we can do is run 2 copies of Hitmonlee in this deck. And there's some things that we could cut out. You certainly could cut the potion. You could, even cut out maybe one of the Druddigon or one of the Marshadow, but I think that probably cutting the potion from this deck and then running 1 extra Hitmonlee, 2 Hitmonlees would be really good, because Hitmonlee for 1 energy on a basic Pokemon can do 30 damage to a bench Pokemon. Magikarp just happens to have 30 HP and oftentimes is sitting on our opponent's bench. So I do think that this deck actually has a lot of potential. However, it can get a little bit awkward if you have a Geodude or a Druddigon in the active spot and then you draw into Hitmonlee. We're kind of going to need a Leaf to retreat out. We are running 2 copies of Leaf, so it's not a surefire strategy. We are running a lot of other basic Pokemon in the deck. But Hitmonlee is a really good card to counter Magikarp just again because you can one-shot it on their bench, which is really strong. So I think that that's a good reason why Golem is actually a pretty decent matchup against Gyarados. That and the fact that, like I said, Golem is not getting one-hit KO'd by Gyarados, which is really strong for sure. But yeah, so this deck is really good. Hitmonlee is really good. Maybe run 2 copies of Hitmonlee to counter that necessarily, to counter that Gyarados. Or that Magikarp rather, sitting on their bench. The one downside with Gyarados sometimes is that you're running a lot of Pokemon, right? You're running Druddigon, you're running Magikarp, Gyarados, and then you're running sort of the 2-2-2 Greninja line, so there's a lot of Pokemon in their deck, so they're not necessarily guaranteed to draw into that Gyarados really early on, or even their Magikarp, right? So if they go a turn or 2 without benching a Magikarp or without finding Gyarados to evolve that Magikarp, there's a lot of openings for these bench sniping cards to take out those Magikarps before they evolve into Gyarados. And I think that's really what these matchups kind of come down to. So yeah, Golem definitely going to be a good contender. Now let's take a look at the deck that I think definitely best counters Gyarados. It's what the statistics tell us, and that is going to be Pikachu with Zebstrika. Now, in my personal opinion, I think across the board, Pikachu and Zebstrika is a good deck. I think it's the second best way to play Pikachu. I do think that the Raichu card has a little bit more flexibility. However, if we're looking to specifically counter Gyarados in this metagame, I would play the Zebstrika variant. And that's just because Zebstrika for a stage 1 Pokemon can do the Thunder Spear. That's 30 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, including the bench Pokemon. And yes, it doesn't hit for weakness, but it's 30 damage. Magikarp has 30 HP, and it's only 1 energy to use this attack. So it's really, really strong. At any point in this game, all of our Pokemon have a retreat cost of 1, so we don't have to play Leaf. That's a big upside for this deck. We have extra room for like potions, but at 2x speed, we can basically, retreat right out for free from whatever's in our basic or active position, whether that's Pikachu, Zapdos, or Dedenne, and then just go ahead and attack with Zebstrika. So this puts a lot of pressure on our opponent's bench, and the idea with this counter is that we're basically, like I said before, a little bit more likely to stop our opponent from getting that Gyarados fully set up. And even if we don't, we have other options. Like Dedenne is a card that is hitting Gyarados for super effective for 1 energy, and it has a 50% chance to paralyze it, right? So this card is actually quite good. Dedenne is quite good against Gyarados because even if we're kind of facing down a Gyarados, even if they just steamroll and they get Gyarados on turn 2, they flip heads on Misties, we can go into our Dedenne, do 30 damage pokes for only 1 energy with this basic Pokemon, and then we have a 50% chance to just stall. So if we flip a couple heads with Dedenne, we're going to chip down that Gyarados to the point where, yes, maybe it gets down to 110 HP or 120 HP, where we're then going to be in range of Pikachu EX. However, like we said in this deck list, only 1 Giovanni, so one thing I really would do in these Pikachu decks is run 2 copies of Giovanni. Like I said, just to keep pressure on the active Pokemon and start, having the potential to KO those Druddigons in the active spot. Just like the other Pikachu list we saw only running 1 Giovanni, I think you could probably cut a potion from this deck and run 2. And yeah, 2 Sabrina, 2 Giovanni with Pikachu, Zebstrika, or Electabuzz. Any of these Pikachu decks configurations I think are going to be really good against Gyarados. And Pikachu is just a really good deck overall. I mean, we're going to see it probably win a lot of tournaments. One, because it does counter... it does counter Gyarados, but it's just good across the board. It's just a very consistent deck, has a really great tempo to it, and none of its attacks, none of the Pokemon in this deck have attacks that take a ton of energy. 2 Zapdos in the deck here. Zapdos is still a fairly good option, just like I said, because it does have, the ability to one-hit KO Gyarados, so there is that kind of Hail Mary option as well. But if you're not running Raichu, then yeah, 2 copies of Zapdos is probably needed just for those sort of big home run plays. But let's take a look at the next deck here that I'm going to showcase, and this is actually Gyarados with Starmie, right? So yes, potentially we can counter Gyarados with Gyarados. Now this deck list is interesting, but it does have a big upside, whereas perhaps the other Gyarados doesn't, which is basically the flexibility to utilize multiple Gyaradoses in one game. Gyarados has a lot of HP in its attack cost, right? That being 3. However, we can basically, and this deck is interesting, it's not actually running any retreat cost options, but we are running Starmie, which does have free retreat. But I would maybe, cut out, a Giovanni in this list, maybe even cut out like, something, I don't know. I would maybe thin this deck out a little bit to maybe run like 1 copy of Leaf or 2 copies of Leaf, just so that we can basically shuffle between multiple Gyaradoses, right? Even if we're a turn behind and our opponent attacks us with a Gyarados, we attack them, they're going to take a KO. Now we can we basically could retreat out of the active spot, even if it is Gyarados, and then move our energies around with Vaporeon to set up a second Gyarados, right? That's kind of the idea with this list. It's also a little bit more from a tempo deck perspective. It's flexible because we are running Starmie in the deck list, right? So Starmie is able to get damage out really consistently on turn 2. It's a stage 1 Pokemon, 2 energies and its attack cost. So very oftentimes we're able to start hitting for 90 damage before or earlier, right? So one thing we can do is if we're not running Leaf in this list, we can run an extra Giovanni. Like I said, Starmie's hitting 90, so this could put a lot of pressure on the active spot if we have a couple copies of Giovanni to get up to that 100 damage and just start KOing Druddigons in the active spot. So I do actually think that this version of Gyarados could rise in popularity. It doesn't have necessarily as consistent of a matchup spread across the board as Druddigon and Greninja with Gyarados, but it does put a little bit more tempo pressure with Starmie EX on opposing Gyarados decks that aren't running Starmie, right? So I do think that you can counter in some ways Gyarados with Gyarados, which is an important aspect to to understand. So if you're really adamant on playing Gyarados and you do believe in it, but you want to counter other Gyarados decks, this is sort of an off-meta version of Gyarados that I think does actually do well in that other matchup against the other Gyarados deck. Okay. So the last deck that I want to take a look at is actually Charizard EX. Now, this doesn't make a lot of sense on paper, perhaps, that Charizard would have a good matchup against Gyarados, but you got to understand, Gyarados isn't necessarily a super fast-paced deck. It does have the potential to kind of pop off and go crazy with Misties, and the fact that Gyarados is only a stage 1 Pokemon, but it's typically sort of a setup and sweep deck, and one of the decks that kind of counters Gyarados in its playstyle is in fact Charizard EX, and the reason for this is just because Charizard hits for 200 damage. It's actually the only Pokemon in the game that can consistently one-hit KO Gyarados. And we have 180 HP. We are weak to water type, but Gyarados is only doing 140. So yes, basically we're going to be in a position to where we can one-hit KO opposing Gyaradoses while not getting one-hit KO'd back. And that's, again, just an upside to Gyarados, or Charizard rather. So this matchup is interesting. We are running Arcanine to help with other matchups, but overall, we're going to have to see how well Charizard and Arcanine's placement in the metagame really is. Mew is still pretty prevalent. However, with the decline of Mewtwo because of the incline of Gyarados, this is going to kind of make it so that Charizard is able to kind of rise back up and kind of, you know, see a little bit more play. It really just depends if that Arcanine, Moltres, and Mew EX deck rises a little bit more in popularity. That deck, again, might have a good matchup against this Charizard deck. It's maybe perhaps just a little bit more consistent. We're also running Mew to KO Charizard, so that is sort of an option for fire-type decks. But yes, Charizard, in fact, does have a pretty decent matchup against Gyarados, and I think that that's very interesting indeed. Okay, so one deck list that I don't actually have to show right now. In fact, maybe I can pull it up here. Give me 1 second. Okay, awesome. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is Alakazam. Now, some people have been sort of watching this entire video this last 10-15 minutes, and they're thinking to themselves, oh, what about Alakazam? What about Alakazam? What about Alakazam? This isn't something that has necessarily caught on over the last few big online tournaments, but yes, this is in fact something that counters Gyarados. Alakazam is a stage 2 Pokemon, has an attack cost of 3 to Psychic, but it does 60 plus 30 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. Now, Gyarados needs 4 energies to attack. Okay, we all know that, and the math works out to where Alakazam perfectly one-hit KOs Gyarados. Now, in theory, that's the case. However, Gyarados does have a chance to discard an energy after it attacks from itself. This kind of seems like a drawback of Gyarados, but in the Alakazam matchup, it can be the difference of you one-hit KOing Gyarados or not. So yes, a lot of people are saying that Alakazam is a good counter to Gyarados, and in fact it is. Alakazam's not a bad card right now in the format. A lot of Pokemon require 3 or 4 energies to attack, and you know, you can run the Druddigon package as we see in this deck list, Sigilyph, and Mew EX. So there's a lot of different cards that we can run with Alakazam. You could just kind of squeeze it into a Mewtwo and Gardevoir deck, which is totally possible. This was just sort of the first Alakazam deck that I saw. This card, or this deck specifically went like 5 and 4 in a tournament. So yes, Alakazam is possible, right? It is sort of a counter meta pick, but like I said, you got to keep in mind that Gyarados, after it attacks and KOs your Pokemon, it has the chance to discard an energy from itself, going down to only 3, which is going to put it out of range of getting KO'd by Alakazam. So it's something to definitely keep in mind. However, yes, if you are an Alakazam lover, technically Alakazam is a great counter to Gyarados. However, overall, I just don't think that it's as good of a deck as those Pikachu decks that we saw, or even the other Gyarados deck or the Golem deck. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt, right? Only so many options here to work with right now with the current card pool that we have. I do think that Pikachu is definitely our best option, and we're going to see a massive rise in Pikachu just because people are starting to understand that, okay, Gyarados is beating all of the decks that we consider to be the best deck in the format, decks that had good matchups against Pikachu. However, now we have to counter this Gyarados deck, so Pikachu is going to rise back up. So I think we're going to see an equilibrium. One thing that I can say for certain is that Celebi EX is going to go way down. I think people over the next couple weeks will slowly stop playing Celebi once they realize that it's not really winning much. It does have the potential to win. I'm not saying it doesn't. Celebi isn't a terrible deck. It isn't necessarily the most consistent thing in the world, but yes, you have the opportunity to go crazy and just win every matchup. You know, RNG works like that. So Celebi can win, but in terms of consistency, I just don't think that Celebi is going to be, you know, a top deck in this format. So I think we're going to see Celebi decline. I think we're probably going to see Scolipede and Weezing decline as Mewtwo also declines. And we're going to see things like Mewtwo, Pikachu, Gyarados, maybe even Charizard, maybe even Scolipede, things like that, kind of all kind of evening out in this format, and it's actually kind of healthy in my opinion. I think a lot of decks beat other decks, and there's actually quite a few viable options to play, and it really just comes down to when you're in a tournament what your matchups are, you know, what the RNG's like, what other sort of decks are you going up against. That Golem deck that won this tournament didn't face a single Celebi the entire tournament, which again was probably a big reason why it was able to win. There were a lot of Celebis being played, but you know, when you're playing against Mewtwo, when you're playing against, you know, Gyarados, fire type decks, things like that, Scolipede, you have a great chance to win tournaments like that, and that's just because it's a good deck. But all decks, even if they're really good, depend on, you know, hitting the right matchups and getting lucky, right? So that's what it's all about. So we'll have to see sort of how that meta evolves, but hopefully this video was somewhat interesting to you guys. And yeah, I just wanted to put this out there because Gyarados has been pretty oppressive in this format for the last few days and then this last big tournament. However, there are cards in our decks that are well positioned to defeat Gyarados in a match. So yeah, anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I've been Maddie. I'm having a great time making these Pokemon TCG Pocket videos. The support has been crazy over the last few weeks, so I really appreciate it. If you're watching my videos, if you're a returning viewer and you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It helps me out a lot. It helps us with the algorithm. Like this video, you know, smash the like button, smash that subscribe button, comment below, what are you playing right now to counter Gyarados? What do you think is the best deck right now to kind of beat these other Gyaradoses that people are playing? I would love to hear your opinion. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. We'll catch you next time. Peace out.